Los Angeles has a reputation. It is not a kind reputation, but then again, it is not a kind city. This episode is about Guillermo del Toro, and we'll soon get to him. But first, let me give you a quick look at a personal experience, one related to the art of Guillermo del Toro. Back in the mid-2000s, I was an intern at a major Hollywood studio. One day, I was asked to cover a desk for an assistant that was out for the afternoon. I was pretty nervous. The studio phone system was daunting. Accidentally dropping a call would have world-shattering consequences. Or so I was told. So I came into the office and introduced myself to the studio executive. I told him my name was Wolfcraft and it was nice to meet him. He didn't care that my name was Wolfcraft, and he cared even less about what I thought was nice and not nice. I sat down at the desk of the assistant, who I became more and more sure was taking a mental health day, and I desperately tried to memorize all I had learned about the phone system. It turned out that the phones were not going to be my big problem that day, but lying was. Let me qualify that. I am not a good liar. That soon became a major problem. You see, the executive was the kind of man who didn't care that he had a gig most would kill for. He only cared about two things: the vacation he was heading on with his bros, and all the babes he and his bros were gonna bang. And I assume disappoint. The calls started coming in. I put them on hold and asked the executive if he'd like to take them. The executive was on his cell phone discussing his rad vacation, so he absolutely did not want to work. He told me to make up something about how he was very busy with important people. Did I mention I'm not a good liar? To make things worse, I was lying to the Hollywood elite, name producers and screenwriters and directors who were calling this studio executive. Making it all worse, they knew this executive was something of a douche, and they knew I was lying on his behalf. The angrier they got, the more transparent my lies became. This went on for hours. The executive spent that entire time on the phone with his friends. Filmmakers called back, and when I was ordered to make up better lies so they'd leave him alone, I felt obliged to come up with them. Sink or swim, they say. Well, I sank. It was a miserable day. Then, late that afternoon, Guillermo del Toro called. This was before del Toro became a powerhouse director. He was well known, sure, for films like The Devil's Backbone, and Blade 2, and Hellboy. But he was still a smaller cult director, not yet recognized for his genius. And I had plenty of geniuses yell at me that day, so I figured, well, here we go again. Why was Guillermo del Toro calling, you ask? He didn't have a film in production at the studio at the time. In fact, he had just finished his last picture. He was screening this new, so far little-seen Spanish film called Pan's Labyrinth for Studio Brass, and Mr. Douchey Studio Executive had been charged with arranging the screening. But Mr. Studio Executive was too busy with his upcoming vacation to make any such arrangement. He told me to tell del Toro that the screening was cancelled. Nervously, I asked what reason I should give for the cancellation. "Make something up," he said, clearly thinking I was an idiot. So I got on the phone and gave Mr. del Toro the bad news. Guillermo del Toro asked why. Now, I can't remember what lie I told, but I assure you it was a poor one, and an insulting one, and del Toro saw right through it. I expected, yet again, to be yelled at. Guillermo del Toro didn't. Instead, he comforted me. Again, I don't remember his exact words, because I was at this point more than a little emotional and trying desperately not to show it. All I now remember is that del Toro told me it was okay, and that it was not my fault, and that he knew exactly what had happened, and he repeated, "It is not your fault." I hung up in shock, and somehow the last few hours of that day didn't bother me. Of course, in the end, Mr. del Toro was also just fine. His little movie that the executive dismissed as too irrelevant to screen went on to be nominated for the Best Foreign Language Film at the Academy Awards, and today Guillermo del Toro is recognized as one of Hollywood's great auteurs. He is particularly interesting as a director of dark fantasy films, many of which also cross over into the horror genre. There are plenty of themes worth exploring in his films, like fascism, mythology, feminism, bugs, and tons more. But due to my personal experience, I'd like to focus on one aspect, and only one, seen frequently in Guillermo del Toro's films: kindness. The worlds of Guillermo del Toro are dark, and they're filled with victims of cruelty and malice. Often these people are underdogs, like children, or women in a male-dominated society, or odd creatures that don't quite fit in anywhere. Yes, these are not gentle worlds. These are nightmares. But his films all have something in common. Their main characters are often kind in the face of adversity and cruelty, and his villains are often cruel when faced with kindness. If you don't dip below the surface, this could be seen as a rather binary choice, without much depth. But I disagree. Because this choice seems to form a thesis in Del Toro's cinema. In his hands, the subject of kindness is explored thoroughly. On his Wikipedia page, I found a quote I thought was particularly interesting. He said, "I believe in man. I believe in mankind as the worst and the best that has happened to this world." Most of Del Toro's films feature protagonists who are fundamentally good people. They are faced with adversity, and they are tested. What path will they choose? Let's start at the very beginning, with Cronos, made on a low budget in Mexico in 1993. The film follows Jesus Gris, a grandfather who becomes vital and young after being exposed to an archangel statue with a magical insect inside. It couldn't be a Del Toro movie without bugs. Unfortunately, Jesus also acquires the thirst for blood. The film follows Jesus as he struggles with his humanity, tempted by immortality, but sustained by his love for his granddaughter. Ultimately, his humanity wins, though perhaps at a dark price. Del Toro followed his strong debut with Mimic, a film made within the studio system. Mimic was an unhappy experience due to the meddling from the Weinstein brothers. It was generally dismissed, both by critics and at the box office. Creatively recharging himself, Del Toro made The Devil's Backbone, released in 2001. The story is set during the Spanish Civil War, and its antagonist Jacinto is specifically cruel because he, as actor Eduardo Noriega points out, has become embittered after growing up an orphan. The cruelty he endured results in cruelty heaped upon others. He is a character who was unable to sustain kindness after the world was unkind to him, and he has become a monster. Meanwhile, the hero is young Carlos, who endures the harsh life of an orphan, but unlike Jacinto, he doesn't let his bitter circumstances change him. Carlos manages to befriend orphanage bully Jaime by basically being a good-hearted stand-up kid, and soon he also comes in contact with the orphanage ghost, Santi, who warns him that many will soon die. I highly recommend The Devil's Backbone. It is a less-known horror classic, but more than that, it is a spiritual predecessor to Pan's Labyrinth, which is one of Del Toro's finest films. Del Toro followed The Devil's Backbone with Hellboy, which is a fun and compelling story of outsiders, and despite the main title character being a literal demon, he's basically a great guy with a big heart. But it was Pan's Labyrinth that truly cemented Del Toro's career as a master filmmaker. The conclusion of Pan's Labyrinth is specifically about an act of kindness. Protagonist Ophelia wants to enter the realm of the underworld, where she believes she will take her place as Princess Moana, reincarnated. But as the faun tells her, it requires the sacrifice of the blood of an innocent, meaning her baby half-brother. Ophelia refuses, with dire consequences. It is a choice of kindness in a dark world. She is unwilling to sacrifice another for herself, choosing to protect the infant. Del Toro continued to work as a director, with films like Hellboy 2: The Golden Army, Pacific Rim, and the severely underrated Crimson Peak. He also worked as a producer, as a screenwriter, and as a visual and creative consultant. Del Toro's career hit a new high with The Shape of Water, which won him a directing Oscar and won Best Picture at the Academy Awards. The film is also a prime example of kindness as a plot driver. The Shape of Water features marginalized characters who are oppressed and badly treated by the systems they are trapped in. Doug Jones's creature is tortured and experimented on, but is able to recognize kind humans from cruel ones. Richard Jenkins's gay best friend is routinely stepped on by society, but he's ready to forgive the creature for eating his cat. Octavia Spencer is taken for granted by her husband, but stands up for both herself and for others. Michael Stuhlbarg's Soviet spy is in danger not just of discovery, but also of assassination by his own, but he still chooses to protect others. And Sally Hawkins' mute cleaner is ignored by society at large, but doesn't let that stop her from trying to free a fellow sentient creature from a gruesome fate. Michael Shannon stands as their adversary, and he represents a conformity of evil that is rotten to the core. So rotten, in fact, that the movie literally shows body parts falling off of the man as his corruption grows. It is a film set in a dark world, but whose primary theme is the kindness of individuals. With these films, I believe we are getting a window into Guillermo del Toro's soul. Is Del Toro a kind man in real life? I don't know. I've never actually met him face to face, but I'll say this, he was truly kind to me on the phone. I think it is a safe bet to say he's kind in person as well. Before I end this episode, let me tell you another story from my life as a Hollywood intern. About a year after my studio experience, I interned at a large production company. There were some nice people there, and the atmosphere was generally friendlier than at the studio, but there was still a dark side to it all. One day, one of the executives at the company asked me to go pick up a pizza for his good friend who was at home and sick and could use a greasy pick-me-up. Okay. Not exactly what I signed up for. I wasn't getting paid, and I was only there for the film experience, but I felt I couldn't say no. So I went to pick up the pizza, and I drove up into the canyons of Los Angeles, finally finding the address of the executive's friend. I knocked on the door. No answer. I saw a woman inside. I kept knocking, as the executive, let's call him douchey executive number 2, had insisted it was very important I deliver this pizza. Finally, the woman came to the door. Turns out she had heard me the first 2 times, and she was furious, asking what the hell I wanted when she specifically requested privacy. This was a surprise to me. I told her I had brought her husband a pizza. "What kind of a sick joke is this?" she asked. I cleverly replied. Well, she soon let me know that I was a cruel bastard. Through raging tears, she explained that her husband had just survived massive heart surgery and that he was on a strict diet. A greasy pizza would probably kill him. I stood there stupidly as she waited for me to explain myself. I didn't know what to say or do, so in a dumb panic, I said perhaps the pizza wasn't a cruel joke, but rather meant for her. She didn't believe that for a second. Then she asked me to leave, but not before calling me an asshole. I really don't blame her. It was a sick, thoughtless, and thoroughly unkind joke. I went back to the production company, and the executive wanted to know how the joke had played. When I told him it was not taken kindly, he simply shut the door on me. So what should you make of this story? Perhaps that the world is often dark, and cruel, and thoughtless. Once in a while, however, you are treated with kindness, even as you appear to others as a villain, or in my case, as a villain's idiot henchman. I don't blame the wife who tore me a new one that day in a dark Los Angeles canyon. And I don't blame all the frustrated people for telling me off for my obvious lies on the phone. They were all right to be angry, frustrated, and upset. But there was something profound about the kindness Guillermo del Toro showed me. For him, I was likely as significant as a drop in the ocean, and he still treated me like a human being. And it made such an impact on me that it carried me through that day. And when I feel the world is cruel, all I need to do is think back on that one short conversation, or better yet, watch one of his movies, for they remind me that there is a great deal of kindness in our dark world. My name is Wolf Craft. This is History of Horror. If you have enjoyed this episode, please like, share, and subscribe. Join me next time for episode 8. In Space, They Sure Do Scream a Lot, an episode about how science fiction and horror cinema intersect. Speaking of science fiction, I'm also a writer, and I've written a science fiction novel called God of Desolation. It is available on Amazon, and if you have Amazon Prime, you can download it for free for Kindle. Check it out, and thanks aplenty.